The 1917 Code's problems. Before we look at where the 1917 Code is not spotless, which again was possible because it was not promulgated as binding upon all in the Church, I want to emphasize something. There's almost no group on earth, and that includes the various so-called traditionalist groups that claim to have priests, which simply takes the 1917 Code and accepts it without qualification. That's because the 1917 Code of Canon Law forbids those groups from ordaining priests, consecrating bishops, offering masses, hearing confessions, etc. According to the letter of the 1917 Code, their entire ministry is illicit. As a result, those groups simply do not follow those laws of the 1917 Code. Rather, they look at the 1917 Code and they say, well, I don't think this canon applies to me, and I don't think that this canon applies to my situation for this reason, etc. They attempt to apply Catholic principles to determine which parts of the Code are applicable and binding in our day, and which parts are not. Their behavior is more evidence that the Code was not promulgated as something that Catholics simply receive, believe, and profess without qualification. That was not its purpose. It was a collection of disciplines with some references to matters of faith for a certain segment of the Church. If one may apply Catholic principles to the Code to determine which parts don't need to be followed in our day, then likewise one may apply Catholic principles to identify which parts are not to be followed because they contradict a divine law or something of greater weight. At the beginning of the Code, we find the profession of faith the Church promulgated in connection with the Councils of Trent and Vatican I. This infallible profession, which is binding upon all the members of the Church, declares that the sacraments of the new law are necessary for salvation, although all are not necessary for each individual. That's what every Catholic must profess, and it proves that at least one sacrament, namely baptism, is required for salvation. The profession does not state that the sacraments or the desire for them are necessary for salvation, which it could have taught if that were the true position, but it did not because that's not the true position. The fact that at least one sacrament is necessary for salvation is what we find in all the Church's professions on this matter, which are binding upon the entire Church. If baptism of desire were true, it would be found in the Church's universal professions of faith, but it's not found in any of them or in any infallible statement. There are many other dogmatic arguments that refute baptism of desire, as our material covers. We will not repeat all of those arguments in this video. The Church teaches that John 3:5 is true without exception. See our playlist of videos on the salvation and baptism issues for abundant evidence. The Code also contains laws that contradict the idea of baptism of desire. For instance, the Code says that the unbaptized cannot gain an indulgence, Canon 925, that the unbaptized are not bound to ecclesiastical laws, Canon 12, and that baptism makes one a member of the Church, Canon 87. According to those canons, the unbaptized are not in the Church or subject to the Church. That contradicts the idea of baptism of desire because those who are not in the Church and subject to the Church cannot be saved. That's dogmatically certain. See the bull Unam Sanctam of Boniface VIII, among other things. Canon 6 of the Code says that disciplinary laws retain their force if the laws of divine law. That applies to the Church's traditional teaching that excludes the unbaptized from ecclesiastical communion and church burial. Canon 1323 of the Code ensures the proper magisterial principles. It repeats that Catholics must believe what is proclaimed by the Church's magisterium. Well, the magisterium teaches that John 3:5 is true without exception, and that there is no salvation without baptism and the Catholic faith. The same canon also says that something must not be understood as dogmatically defined or declared unless this is manifestly established. Many supporters of baptism of desire and John 3:5 mockers violate that canon by falsely claiming that it's heresy to deny baptism of desire. Baptism of desire is not manifestly established as dogmatically defined. In fact, it's demonstrably false. That being said, the Code does contain a few errors and novelties, which again was possible because it was not promulgated as binding upon all. In Canon 1239, after repeating the traditional law of the Church that those who die without baptism are not to be given ecclesiastical burial, the Code inserts a novelty. It says that catechumens who die without baptism through no fault of their own are to be reckoned as baptized. That is a novelty and an error. First, how would a priest determine and judge that a catechumen died without baptism through no fault of his own, and on that basis reckon that person as inside the Church? Second, the Church's traditional law, which is binding upon all, excludes unbaptized catechumens from church burial because they weren't inside the Church or part of the faithful during life. See our video on the Council of Braga, which was approved by Pope St. Gregory VII. The Church's universally binding and traditional law on this matter, which was approved by popes such as Leo the Great, St. Gregory VII, Innocent III, Gregory IX, etc., is that Catholics cannot communicate after death with those who were not in the Church's communion during life. This law is definitive and outweighs the Code's novelty. As Pope St. Gregory VII expressed it, quote, We cannot differ from the relevant sentence of the Holy Fathers, namely, with those with whom we have not communicated while they were living, we do not venture to communicate with while they are dead. End quote. This law was also included in the Decretals of Gregory IX, Book 3, Title 28, Chapter 12. This is what all Catholics are bound to in this regard. Catholics are not permitted to insert into Catholic communion individuals such as the unbaptized, who were not in Catholic communion during life. And as we saw, even the Code's own canons make it clear that unbaptized catechumens and the unbaptized in general are not in the Church's communion. That's why the unbaptized are not bound to ecclesiastical law, not subject to the Church, etc. In fact, the commentator Cicconiani admits that by divine law, the unbaptized, including unbaptized catechumens, are not subject to the Church's laws. The same is taught by many others. On this point, the Council of Trent infallibly declared that the Church exercises no judgment or jurisdiction over those who are not baptized. Ergo, it's contrary to the divine law to tell priests to treat unbaptized persons as if they are and were under the Church's jurisdiction and give them church burial when, by divine law, they could not be under the Church's jurisdiction. So this is an erroneous law and a novelty that reflects the errors on salvation and baptism that were present in many fallible sources before Vatican II. It should not be a surprise that there were errors in fallible sources and documents in the years leading up to Vatican II. Vatican II did not happen overnight, and those who think that everything was super strong in all the fallible sources and theologians right up to Vatican II and then it all went haywire are totally naive, and they have no clue about what's going on. The other error in this regard in the Code is Canon 737. This actually isn't even a law or a prescription of the Code, it's simply an erroneous statement. It says that baptism actually, or at least in desire, is necessary for all for salvation. But that's a novelty. The Church's infallibly promulgated professions, such as Canon 5 at Trent, declare that the sacrament is necessary for salvation. They don't say, at least in desire. But that was changed in this novel and erroneous statement in the Code, which, as we've shown, was not infallible. Does that mean that the Code was a notoriously heretical document? No. In an analogous way, Pope Leo XIII and Pius X approved the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas Aquinas for use after the definition of the Immaculate Conception, even though the Summa contains what is now clear heresy against the Immaculate Conception. Indeed, Pope Pius X formally mandated the use of the Summa in higher schools of Italy, without removing the now heretical teaching against the Immaculate Conception that's in the Summa. Does that mean that Pius X required the use of a notoriously heretical book? No, he required the use of a book that is good overall, but not perfect in every way. A similar principle applies to the Code. The reason that this error in the Code on baptism is not notoriously heretical, even though it is contrary to definitive Catholic teaching, is that there were Catholic saints and theologians who wrongly believed that unbaptized catechumens could be saved. The Code has a few other errors as well. It contradicts itself on heretics. For instance, Canon 1325 of the Code defines a heretic as one who pertinaciously denies or doubts a Catholic truth. So according to the definition of the Code, a heretic is of bad faith. A heretic is someone who is pertinacious. Yet Canon 731, reflecting the growing liberalism of the time, refers to heretics and schismatics who could be in good faith. But that's a contradiction. Someone who is pertinacious against the faith by definition of the Code, Canon 1325, cannot be in good faith, Canon 731. It's contradictory to refer to a heretic in good faith in a document that precisely defines a heretic as someone who is pertinacious or of bad faith. If someone holds a position that is contrary to Catholic teaching in good faith, that person is actually not a heretic. That person is a Catholic erring in good faith. Moreover, it's false to refer to someone who, according to the Code's own words, needs reconciliation with the Church and is therefore outside the Church, as being in good faith. If someone is a heretic who needs reconciliation with the Church, then that person by definition is in bad faith, not good faith. Hence, this is an imprecision and an error in the Code, which again, was not infallible except in those parts in which it repeated infallible Catholic truth. Just as pre-Vatican II commentators on the Code pointed out an error in the Roman ritual, Catholics can point out some errors in the Code. The Code also had a liberal law on passive attendance at non-Catholic funerals, services, and weddings, which opens the door to things that are not consistent with Catholic teaching and tradition. But that's a separate discussion. The fact is that there were many liberal canonists and theologians at the time the Code was produced. In almost all cases, the Code does reflect Catholic principles and traditional laws. However, in the few instances in which it contradicts something of greater weight, we must go with the more definitive teaching. That applies to the novelties and false canons on baptism in the Code.